really excited to know a few things about you. Um, so obviously the biggest thing you're known for is Stack Overflow. You've
Mhm.
answered I don't know how many questions, but too many for me to count.
I think it's about 35,000. I haven't checked for me. I can check very easily now, but I'm pretty sure it's around 35,000, which is not the highest number. Gordon has answered more questions than I have. So I'm at 35,234.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
So how does that make you feel? Like that's so many questions. Like do you feel proud for that?
yeah. I would hope not too proud. So I don't conflate having answered a lot of questions with being the best programmer by any means. So I don't answer as many questions now, simply because I don't see as many that I feel able to answer that are well asked questions. I probably have slightly higher standards for what I'll answer these days than I did in the first year or two of Stack Overflow. But yes, I'm proud of the contribution that I hope I've made to the community, and that I keep making. So even though I don't answer as many questions now, I still spend a lot of time on the site, and my most frequent kind of interaction is adding comments to questions, suggesting ways in which the question could be improved. Whether that's formatting, or we need more clarity, or I suggest you follow Java naming conventions, or whatever it is. Yeah, so hopefully that's still valuable in a slightly different way.
Yeah, definitely this. But it takes so much time, 35,000 questions. Like if you divide it from your how many years have you been answering it for?
So 12 years, I think, coming up to 13 years. I think it was September 2008 that I started. And yeah, now that number is less impressive than it might have been when I, in the first few years. The number of questions I've answered has sort of plateaued quite significantly. I was spending significantly longer answering questions than I do now, and I don't have enough time to do that now, even if the questions were there, to be honest. But yes, it's taken a lot of time.
And where did you find that time? Did you like do it in between your breaks? Did you do it after work or before
Yeah,
you start the
so
workday?
in personal time, on the train, back when I used to be working in the office in London all the time. It's not just the pandemic. I've been working from home most of the time for quite a while now, and it's glorious because my commute is 3 hours as a round trip. So that's 3 hours of my day that I don't have to spend just traveling. Um,
Yeah.
and there were some benefits of that, in that probably 3/4 of an hour of that was walking each day, or more. But uh, it's a much more effective use of my time. But I used to spend time during the commute doing Stack Overflow, but I've always just switched between, you know, write some code, write a design doc, read some email, check Stack Overflow, write some more code, and just fluidly switch between things. I'm terrible at actual multitasking, so don't ask me to listen to a podcast and write code at the same time, for example. But I am good at context switching, so I'm quite happy to write a bit of one design doc, then switch and write a bit of a different design doc, etc. I'm not one of those people who needs, right, get in the zone and nothing can disturb me for 3 hours. I don't work like that.
Right. Um, so regarding the zone itself, do you find it being like a useful state for a programmer or something more of a detrimental thing?
I can only talk about myself, really. I find there have certainly been times where I've managed to not be disturbed by anyone for 4 or 5 hours and get loads of code written and feel great after that. Um, but that's quite a constraint on the rest of the world, whether that's colleagues not being able to get my attention, or me not have any meeting with colleagues, or just my family. I like seeing my family quite frequently. So my wife works from home as well, so we're able to have lunch together and coffees and things. So finding a block of time that I'm not going to be disturbed by anyone else, and that doesn't cost anyone else anything, is relatively rare. And to be honest, even when I get that time, often I will find, do you know what? I'm not kind of in the mood for getting head down in one thing and deeply engaged in that one thing and thinking about nothing else. So I flit around quite a lot, even when I do have dedicated time.
Yeah.
But that's very much just me. I mean, hopefully we're more aware these days that different people's brains work in very different ways, and particularly within software engineering, neurodiversity is a big thing. So yeah, I think that's something to be celebrated, rather than trying to make us all the same.
That's true. There are no template solution. We are all different, and well, we do share similar problems, though. Sometimes we solve something, and I think there is no programmer in the world who hasn't been stuck ever on a problem that seemingly might be unsolvable, like for that moment in time.
Mm-hmm.
How do you approach that? Those impediments, being stuck, and yeah.
So that's where flitting around is kind of useful. So if I'm frustrated with something, I'll go and do something else. If it's a work thing, then I've probably got other work things I should get on with. But in hobby programming, I've got enough hobby bits of code going on and other personal commitments, which are slightly flexible, that I've always got something else I can do. And that can help, the brain trying to solve the problem in the background. And frequently, after a good night's sleep, I'll wake up with another idea, and then sometimes that fails as well, and then I'll wait for the next one to come. And it's not like sleep is a magical thing that solves everything first time, but it is useful to try to get away from things. Or the other thing, if I'm really stuck on something and I feel I don't know which way is going to be the right way, I'll make sure everything is committed in Git or wherever I'm working, and just try something and go as far as I feel I can easily in a mostly prototypey kind of way, which may involve test-driven development or often doesn't. So if I know, if it's something fairly small and it's not an architectural problem, it's an implementation problem, then I would definitely go test-driven. If it's more of an architecture problem and I don't quite know how things will hang together architecturally, I don't tend to go test-driven for that, because I end up finding that the tests need as many changes as the implementation, so it's sort of that halves my velocity. Whereas when it's an implementation bit, it's absolutely crucial. Certainly for hobby projects, I am not as test driven as I probably should be. Not even write the tests afterwards in many cases. Depends what I'm doing. What I view as a professional-ish hobby project like Node a Time is very thoroughly tested, and I would always write tests for that. A lot of the code I'm writing right now is integration code with other systems, and the value is in the integration, and that tends to be something that is fiendishly difficult to actually write tests for, and is unlikely to find. The kind of bugs that I find in my system aren't the ones that tests would find. That may say more about me as a tester than anything else. Maybe I just need to learn new techniques. But for the moment, most of those systems I'm finding I can just do prototyping rather than the normal kind of unit tests. And the test is whether it feels right when I've written it. If it still feels horribly smelly, Sometimes I'll keep what I've got and come back to it later on, but it's not something that a test would tell you this is good or not. So I persevere that way.
Yeah, fair enough. Um, it's interesting when you talked about TDD. You said that. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you see a bigger picture how design is laid out, you will feel comfortable with applying TDD, but you will not be very comfortable to apply it when, let's say, you won't be comfortable to apply it, for example, to come up with a design as part of TDD.
It sort of depends on what I'm building. So for Node time, for example, the design of how you would use this from code is a significant part of the value proposition. So for that, that's more design than architecture, and I feel definitely comfortable saying, okay, well, if I can't write tests for how this would work, or sometimes not even tests but sample code, how would I expect to see this used within an application? And that's a kind of test in itself. That I'm fine with. It's more when I'm writing an application itself with plenty of user interface and interfacing with Zoom and with a camera and a mixer and launching VLC. And I'm thinking of a particular project that I'm working on for church at the moment, which I would imagine that I could write it in a testable way, but it would add an awful lot of overhead, and I would sort of design the testability, and then 2 weeks later I'll need to redesign it because I'm evolving the actual overall architecture a bit more. What I did with a hobby project called vDrum Explorer, which is still integration based, but for my drum kit, is after several iterations, I have now got what I believe to be a testable WPF app. I haven't actually written the tests, but I believe I could now. But again, the number of places where the kind of bugs it finds, or even the design issues that TDD finds, isn't always a good use of time. Whereas in plenty of other projects, I don't want people to get the wrong impression that I don't appreciate tests. That's absolutely not the case. So I've recently been working on the Cloud Events SDK for C#, and writing some code to encode and decode HTTP header values in a particular percent encoding with some extra things. And I would be lost without the tests there, absolutely. And other aspects, testing, event formatters, and all kinds of things where the testing is appropriate, I'm absolutely there, love it. I just don't think it's, for me at least, a worthwhile balance in absolutely everything. It would be fascinating to see how a real TDD aficionado and expert approach doing the kind of applications that I'm doing for hobby purposes, and how that would affect how they, if you've spent some time coming up with the testability aspect, are you then less inclined to try changing the architecture because you need to change all of those tests? It's great when you can change the implementation of something without changing any tests at all. But when you need to change the tests as well as the implementation, maybe it just changes the boundary of where you're willing to redesign. I don't know. It would be interesting to watch someone else do that.
I agree. Well, that's the point also of tests, I guess, in some way, that if you made the change, it 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 kind of breaks, and not always it breaks, in some ways that, it continues to compile in terms of tests.
Right.
But I get what you mean. So for greater design problems like architecture, it's difficult to do TDD because it involves infrastructure and stuff, and that's where it often fails. It's great for unit testing and stuff, for
Yeah,
smaller.
and also very, very useful for integration testing. So most of my work is writing the Google Cloud Client libraries, or maintaining them. So some of that is designing the generation process, the release process. Some is writing actual manual code, but most of the code in those client libraries is generated. Now, I'm not a huge fan. We do have unit tests for the generated code, and those unit tests are generated as well. And I've never been entirely sure of how much value that provides. But for the manually written code, we have loads of integration tests, because if you want to know how Spanner is going to behave when you've got a table in a particular format or whatever, the way of finding out is to run your tests against Spanner. So
Yep.
yes, you could mock out the actual database and say, if my code gets back exactly what I expected my code to get back, does it work? Like, well, that only tells you half the question. It's really,
Yep.
is your code going to get back what you expected? So I'm a big fan of integration tests, and keeping them quite distinct from unit tests. You think about them in a different way, and it's good to have both.
Right. I definitely agree. What do you think about other kinds of tests? Like if you go a bit further, you have functional tests like spec flow and BDD kind of thing.
I haven't tried them. I have generally, the aspect of BDD that I'm aware gets a lot of the attention, perhaps undeservedly, or undeservedly is the wrong word, but possibly misleadingly, let's say, because it possibly makes you think it's all about that rather than other things, is I'm going to write tests in this sort of pseudo English. It looks a bit like English, so long as
Yes.
it's almost conversational. But my guess is that the promise of, well, this means anyone can write the functional test, and the acceptance tests at least. No, you still need to know. It's basically a programming language that looks a bit like English. It's not like you can express anything in any conversational style. So I've always been a bit skeptical about that. On the other hand, I haven't tried it in anger, and I'm loath to judge things that I haven't really tried fully. Aspects of BDD I do like are coming up with consistent terminology and using that throughout, and trying to avoid overload of terminology, or, oh, well, ID over here is name over there, is GUID over there, and they all mean the same thing. Or, well, you're saying, what kind of offer is it, for example, and someone else is kind and they mean something different. So yeah, the idea that any concept should be called one thing and only one thing, and that should be the only thing called that, I'm completely with that on the BDD side. The testing side, I'm less. I think it's partly because I haven't worked on the kind of application where it's particularly useful. My career has been largely on libraries and backends, and some of those backends it probably would have made more sense than for other work. But when I've been to BDD talks and things, I've always seen the tests and thought those don't usually reflect the kind of code, the kind of domain that I'm in. And I'm aware that I just saying about domain, I may well be conflating BDD and DDD to at least some extent. I'm not. It's terrible. I'm not someone who goes and reads all the books. I'm looking at a bookshelf full of books, half of which I haven't read, and it's kind of embarrassing to say that, but that's, yeah. I have been to a lot of conferences and paid attention in a lot of talks, not quite the same thing. So it's not like I'm trying to say I get along without learning from anyone else. It's that I haven't read all the books that I would like to have done.
And out of the ones that you have read, what would you pick? And what was your favorite?
I really liked Effective Java, and Bill Wagner's Effective C# is also very good. But those are language books rather than general books. I have always found the more general kind of books a little disappointing. I got halfway through Code Complete and kind of
Hmm.
gave up. Partly due to lack of time, partly I'd already found that I profoundly disagreed with the author on a few quite significant things, and so at that point you sort of wonder how much you'll get out. Again, I really should go back and reread these things or read them for the first time in some cases. I'm in no way trying to denigrate the authors. It's just not something I've done. I would say books that have affected my way of thinking more, and that having an impact on how I approach work, let's say. I could reel off a bunch of excellent feminist books, starting with Everyday Sexism, which have opened my eye, and why I'm no longer talking to white people about race, and various things that are more around social justice and learning to see the world from other people's perspectives. I think they have helped me approach software engineering in a different way, more than anything about here's a good way of testing. Because it's sort of broadened my horizons, opened my eyes a bit more.
Did it bring it more in terms of like how you work as a team, like how you communicate with other people, or
To
in
some
in
extent, it's more about thinking about end users,
mm,
and it's hard to specify to some extent, to be specific about how, if I say discovering feminism, as in discovering for myself the feminism that everyone's been writing about for a long time. I'm not trying to claim I discovered feminism. First encountered feminism, as it were. It has changed my way of thinking about so many things across the board that isolating which of those are to do with work and whatever is quite tricky. But yeah, I think it's been tremendously helpful. Even I'm not saying that I have agreed with everything that every feminist author I've read has written, but even where I've been disagreeing, it's been really very interesting and thought-provoking. Partly to think, well, why do I disagree with that? What does that say something about me? Does that say something about the author, about different life experiences? Is there an objective reality that I'm actually disagreeing with someone over, or is this a matter of just different perspectives? Is this something where there is a right and a wrong, and one of us is right and the other is wrong, or is it literally just different perspectives saying, no, I don't think it is fair that such and such happens, whatever. But yeah, I would recommend for folks wanting to start off, particularly within the software engineering world, which tends to be very data driven. Everyday Sexism by Laura Bates is a very, very good book with lots of details, narrative sections, thoroughly backed up by papers and statistics, etc. The kind of thing that engineers love digging into. And it makes it very hard to deny that there's a problem.
could you give an example of, especially for since you are mostly focused on library writing, on backend, like what is design or end user consideration? What considerations do you have impacted by the ideas you read in those books?
So I would probably try to make things more accessible in terms of language. So there can be, when you're designing a library and trying to work out what to call things, there can sometimes be a tension between precision and being easy to understand. So try to avoid very complicated terminology where it's unnecessary, by just bearing in mind that potentially a large number of people using your API may not have English as a first language. It may not be their second language. I only speak English. I'm incredibly terrible at that. I have profound respect for those who speak 2, 3, 4 languages. And anything I can do to make their lives a bit easier is worth doing. So, play around with some names, see what names will hopefully sound wrong if you're using the method or whatever in the wrong way. Really paying attention to that side of things. Trying to avoid too many cultural biases. So in Node-time is a date and time library. There's already a cultural bias there by I default to the Gregorian calendar. And that's probably reasonable because I think the majority of computing does as well. But I'm more aware of it being an assumption than I would have been before. Paying attention to user studies and just thinking more about how we might want to use whatever functionality. It's hard to give concrete examples of a specific difference because it's a bit of a different way of looking at the world, if you see what I mean.
Well, you already did give good examples.
Okay.
It's great. I learned something as well from this answer, definitely. Because I never had consideration of how would... I do try to make code simple, easy to understand, read, but I would look at it from my own perspective or from someone who is similar to me, like pretending that I come new to the code base, but I never considered other people. Different people, very different people from me. So that's very interesting, right, as a consideration.
So as one concrete example for language, there are various bits of Latin that are reasonably common within English. And again, that depends on your schooling. I went to a private school. My wife went to a private school. She did a classics degree. So if we say, well, that will do pro tem, as in for the moment, and that's a bit of Latin that I would never... it's possible that 10 years ago, I'd have been happy to put that into an API method name as a sort of way of doing something temporary. But the assumption that not only do your consumers know English, but they're going to know the bits of Latin that are common, somewhat common within England, because it could be that there are different bits of Latin that are used in all kinds of different cultures. Like, just, be aware of your own place, John.
That's cool. That's really cool. So out of all these activities, do you have any programming activity, and it can be not necessarily programming specific, but maybe related to programming, maybe communicating to customers, to management, or something similar, something that annoys you as a programmer, quite, or least enjoyable activity as a programmer?
So I would say it's when I am being tech support, which could be for the family, although they're getting better at reporting problems, because they tell me exactly what you mean, or members of the church I belong to, where I'm sort of known as the techie guy and will be phoned up by people with problems. And you see the same thing on Stack Overflow, and you see the same thing with GitHub requests and whatever, where people don't feel any need to be precise in their problem report. You wouldn't dream of going to the doctor and say, I'm not well. Okay, diagnose me from that. But they'll say the app doesn't work. Or even maybe here's some code, it doesn't work. Well, what do you mean by it doesn't work? That's the equivalent of going to the doctor and saying, you can't examine me, but I'm not well. Right, what's wrong? I can't tell. So yes, the lack of precision there. It came back with an error. Well, do you not think that maybe telling me what the error says would be good? And the constant "it did it" with no qualification, and this is typically if I'm talking to someone on the phone who is having a problem with Zoom or something, and they'll say, "It came up with an error." Like, well, what's it to start with? You've given me no context here. Is this the Zoom application or Windows or all kinds of things? And I can understand it happening once or twice, but people don't seem to then take on, okay, this is something I can learn to do better. And there seems to be within the non-tech community, and I think it's even worse when it happens in the tech community. And you've said several times, look, never just put "I get an exception" or "I get a compiler error." Always say what it is, and you see them making the same mistake time and time again. But within the non-tech community, there seems to be a sort of learned helplessness where people say, "I'm not very good with tech," as if that's just a natural thing, can't do anything about it. There's no way I could possibly learn. And if I said the same thing, I'm rubbish at cooking, therefore I won't learn, and I'll say, right, I'm rubbish at cooking, could you come and cook me beans on toast? If I said that to someone, they would expect to say, right, this is how you do it, next time you can do it. And if I then said, no, I can't do cooking, I'm rubbish at cooking, it's like, no, but I've shown you how to do it, you can learn from this, you can become better. Now, I think technology has not done itself any favors in terms of giving really hard to understand error messages and all kinds of things, but people do use that as an excuse to not learn even the basics. If someone who said, I know nothing about tech, would take an hour and learn what a web browser is, and learn, if I say, what email client do you use, or how do you use your email, be able to give me a reasonably concrete example or set of steps that you go through, instead of just saying, I click on the icon. Well, what icon? What does it look like? There are loads of ways of doing it. So I think it's a problem on both sides, but it is very frustrating on trying to provide tech support for non-technical people who are resolutely non-technical and almost wear that as a badge of honor.
That's right. And I face this severe problem with my parents as well. If they ask me to repair their computer and you fix it, but there are problems in the future, you're the one to blame for those problems.
Yeah.
For the lifetime. Um, do you see this happening in professional environment as well? Like, let's say someone who is less experienced than you, but in your team, your colleague, maybe even on senior people. Do you experience that?
So occasionally I will receive bugs from engineers who I think should know better than to say it didn't work or I got an exception. Like, it's really not hard to copy paste the exception, and that's obviously something. I tend to think of it as well, if you were trying to investigate this for yourself, and sure, you may not know the library and you're not going to be the right person to investigate it, but if you were the right person, what extra information would you need? That feels like a reasonable thing, that when you write a bug or a problem report of any description, ask yourself at the end, what extra information am I bound to be asked for next? What is the utterly predictable thing? If it's something that you couldn't easily predict, maybe because you're not familiar with the platform that things are running on or whatever, then that's fine. But if it's just, well, I couldn't be bothered to copy paste the exception, that's a bit disappointing. It really doesn't happen often. I work with fantastic people which is why it's a surprise when it does happen. It happens rather more frequently with on Stack Overflow or on GitHub with people reporting a problem with some of the libraries I'm writing. And the other frustrating aspect is if we'll get into, okay, well, here's my problem. I'll say, oh, could you provide what does your code look like? What error message are you getting? And we'll be 5 or 6 layers down into an exchange when they'll suddenly say, oh, by the way, this is running in, and then some weird environment that is clearly a long way from how those libraries are normally used. It's sort of like saying, well, my arm hurts when I bend it, and then only 10 minutes later saying, yes, I'm doing this as part of a high wire act where I am actually balancing on one leg at the time. And it's like, just surely that's relevant information from the start. Please include it.
That's right. You're doing lots of stuff, but did you always have this, I dare say, passion for programming? Did you, like, from the very early childhood, were interested?
Yeah, so we got a ZX Spectrum when I was 7 or 8, and within a year or so, I played a lot of games on it, but I also started programming on that, and I have enjoyed programming since then, basically. There has very rarely been a time when I wouldn't have some coding on the go, if ever. I'm not sure. Yeah, I can't think of a time where I didn't have some project that I would work on for fun.
And did you see yourself as a programmer from the early days? Like, that's what I want to be as a kid? Or
certainly from probably age 12 or 13, yes, absolutely. And had no idea really what the job would involve. But I did programming. It's try to explain any job to a 12-year-old pretty much. And even smart 12-year-olds won't understand the need for so many meetings, and sometimes I feel exactly the same way. But there's a lot more. You say programmer and you get the image of someone who spends 8 hours of the day programming, and we all know it doesn't work like that. You spend a relatively small amount of your time writing code. It varies from week to week, but maybe it's all documents this week or reviewing other people's code, etc. But yeah, certainly from a pretty young age, this is what I wanted to do.
And what was your first job, if you may?
So my first job was in a shop called Superdrug in the UK. It sells sort of food, medicines, toiletries, some various bath care products and things. And I worked there sort of stacking shelves and on the checkouts and all that kind of thing. I was a shop assistant. And I did that on Saturdays and during holidays for 2.5, maybe 3 years, before my first programming job was at Digital Equipment during vacations and then university vacations, and I stayed with them, and that was my first full-time job was with Digital as well. But I mentioned the Superdrug job because that was really useful as well for giving me more appreciation of how hard people work. Don't get the impression that shop assistants have an easy life. It's really genuinely hard, physically, mentally, just staying alert. Certainly back then when you're on the checkout and having to scan it, before scanning was a thing, and so typing in all the prices, making sure you got the right change time and time again, it's really quite tiring just staying alert all that time and not being able to take a break whenever you want to and have a coffee or whatever. No, you were on duty effectively. And I met a bunch of people that I probably wouldn't have met otherwise. So yeah, that was a really valuable experience. I certainly appreciated it when I then went and joined Digital and got sort of twice the pay for far more enjoyable time. That was great. But I appreciate my time at Superdrug for different reasons.
Cool. Um, you went to uni, and what's your opinion on education, like higher education, and professionalism and programming? Do you see these two correlating well? Because there are many, self.
I would like to see more software engineering courses, or more people taking software engineering courses, and potentially fewer people taking computer science courses,
Hmm.
because I don't think there is a global shortage of computer scientists, but there is a global shortage of software engineers, and people who have trained in computer science and then try to do software engineering. My experience is they're not always very good at it to start with, because there's a lot in software engineering. If what you want to do at the end of the day is a job like mine that involves a lot of writing design docs, working with source control, writing tests, working with other people, all that kind of thing, none of that is really computer science. So it tends not to be taught in computer science courses. But it's absolutely vital, and I would certainly hope it's taught in software engineering courses. And it feels like we need a lot more people who have trained, or at least are good at, the software engineering side. And don't get me wrong, it's not that I have anything against computer science itself as a discipline. I just don't like the idea that, well, I'm good at computer science, therefore, the software engineering's the less tricky bit of it. The computer science is the pure intellectual side. Well, it's certainly intellectual, but so is writing good design docs and collaborating well and writing source code that's maintainable, and all of those things that aren't in quite in the computer science wheelhouse. So whether that means that we need more vocational style courses, I don't know. There does tend to be, in the UK at least, there's a bit of snobbery about vocational courses, and I don't know whether, if you had software engineering courses, would that mean that people didn't take them because they would be regarded as not good enough, or maybe it would be something that lots of people did take up, and that might help to counter the bias of people thinking that vocational courses in themselves were not, were a bit second rate. I would love it if something could do something about that, that way of looking at things. Yeah, I have seen plenty. I've interviewed plenty of people who have been PhD computer scientists who clearly know you ask them algorithmic questions and they're absolutely fine. You ask them to write code and they will always use single letter variable names, and write obscure code because they've never had to maintain anything for longer than one semester. Now that's a gross generalization, and of course there are plenty of people doing PhDs in computer science who also do software engineering.
Yeah.
It's just that that's sort of a coincidence, because it's not the same thing.
My biggest issue with uni is that I'm a big fan of being teaching when you're also practicing the discipline yourself, like professionally. And the issue I have with many lecturers in universities, that often what happens is they are very proficient with theory but not so much with practice, and
Right.
so when they are transferring the knowledge to students, if they don't practice it, especially in programming, it gets out of date really fast, and
Yeah.
and it misses those essential points of maintainability and practicality.
Yeah. And if you want to do theoretical computer science or research into other things, or designing a programming language, you really do need to have the empathy of software engineering. But in various things, it's fine to stick with computer science. But if your goal is to become a software engineer, then learn software engineering. If you want to become an accountant, do an accountancy course, not theoretical maths. deeply pure maths. Maybe you start off with pure maths, but you wouldn't assume that just because I can do extremely complicated, highly theoretical maths, that means I can do your accounts. And it feels to me the same kind of thing with computer science and software engineering. And maybe it's a matter of, in computer science courses, having more modules of software engineering, and put that in there as well. This isn't really computer science, but we think a lot of you will want to become software engineers. I don't know, that would be a practical but might be sniffed at a bit approach.
Yeah, but regardless, it would be very useful, and would, no matter theoretical or practical approach chosen, it's useful for either direction. Very
Yeah,
useful. Yeah.
and I think it would probably be good to have people from industry, a much more collaborative relationship between universities and industry.
Yeah.
I've gone into a university once to give a talk, but that was sort of a fairly, I was going to say an ad hoc thing, and then I'm going back to I really shouldn't use Latin if I'm going to be saying, it was just something that came about once. It was not highly prepared.
Yes.
Whereas if I were to do a course on software engineering or a course on C#, for example, I would need to spend a lot more time preparing something. Do it properly. Don't just parachute in someone from industry as a one-off thing and assume that that's all that you need, and have it as a genuine collaboration so that the person from industry can learn what interesting things are going on in academia as well, really benefit from it. But I'm sure in plenty of places there is that sort of collaboration, but I suspect it could be stronger.
Have you ever worked with a person and looked at them, or silently thought to yourself that there's no way they will be a good programmer ever with this progress, with the way they're doing? Do you see any qualities in people that you will find them bad programmers or not programmers at all?
I have one person who springs to mind that she was on maternity leave when I first started reading her code, and I sort of wasn't looking forward to meeting her in person because I was sniffy about it. I was being snobbish and looking down on her, and regardless of how things actually turned out, that was a bad thing on my side. So I regret that to start with. However, as it happens, she then her attitude was much more okay. So you're not a big fan of the code that I've written. What could I do better? And she, I don't know whether she was like this before going on maternity leave. I don't know the background, but she was voracious afterwards for improving and became really great. And I thoroughly enjoyed working with her. There have been other people that I have not enjoyed working with, and sometimes that's just a personality clash. Sometimes it's people who are unwilling to ever admit mistakes and things. But I try, within being human, I try to get over personality clashes and think to myself, okay, you may not like this person, but give their ideas and whatever they're proposing, if it's a design doc, whatever, give it a fair chance. Just because you're not a fan doesn't mean that they're wrong by any means. So I can't think. I mean, I've been lucky in terms of working with a lot of good people, both in Google and before, and I've learned a huge amount from all kinds of people, and mostly learnt from other people. And I have found that if you work with someone and try to see the best in them, you will often be surprised at just how much there is to appreciate about someone else's perspective. And it sounds ever so trite and I'm kind of aware that either it makes me out to be some kind of saint or makes me out to sound like I want to be thought of as a saint, and that's not the case. I'm yeah, we're all jerks occasionally. I would hope not too often, but catch me on a bad day. I could give you links to GitHub issues which I have not handled as well as I would want to because someone rubbed me up the wrong way and maybe I'd had a bad day or whatever. Now, sometimes, just occasionally, and I'm thinking of one thing in particular, eventually you come to a point and go, whoa, look, time out. Right, I'm sorry, we got off on the wrong foot. Let's start again, and then have a really good collaborative relationship. And sometimes that's not happened, let's say. And sometimes I will look back and think, yeah, I didn't handle that well. And sometimes I'll look back and think, yeah, I still don't know what this person was thinking. Yeah, there are books, when I read books on C#, I'm probably more pedantic than most readers would be. And there are some books that I have criticized a lot, and then the authors come back and we've worked together and their next edition has been just worlds apart different, fantastic. There are other books where I've written a huge list of errors and heard nothing. And I suspect I won't end up working with those authors and would be reluctant to consider doing so. Whereas the ones who will take some criticism and in some cases push back entirely reasonably, whether it's, well, I sort of see what you mean, but we're going for this, or no, you're just wrong because it's like, oh, whoops, yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, there's a range of people. I'm not saying that absolutely everyone is always going to be spectacular to work with, but I do think if you try to see the best in people, you'll do a lot better than if you go into everything wanting to pull someone down. Yeah, it shouldn't be a competition.
That's a really great way to put it, to see the best in the people. At least try, yeah.
Yes.
You started, well, you did have work in Microsoft, in Google, and
Sorry,
so,
just to correct, I've never worked for Microsoft.
oh, sorry.
I'm a Microsoft MVP,
Oh, okay.
but I've never been employed by Microsoft. It's something that a lot of people, you're not the first person to think that I've been employed by Microsoft, but no, I never have.
Okay, I'll put it slightly differently. You
Yeah.
have worked with C# a lot,
Yes. Yes, and
and
still do.
and also, I don't know when it happened, but you also worked with Java a lot.
Yes. So I worked with Java from when it first came out, and then when C# first came out, I would sort of alternate. Not this is just the way that my career happened because I'm not really one to ask for career advice because my career kind of happened to me more than I'm not one of these people who has a what's my 10-year plan. Well, now my 10-year plan is to start retiring, but it's you see people who say, right, in 1 year's time, I'm going to be doing this, then I will change jobs in 3 years' time, whatever. I'm just not like that. It's not how I work. Nothing against people with that kind of planning, but I kind of bumble through life and do what makes me happy. But I, as it happens, I kind of alternated between C# and Java in professional work, doing mostly Java for the first 8 years that I was at Google was almost entirely Java. But I found that when I was doing Java professionally, I would keep doing C# for fun, both in terms of writing code and writing C# in depth and writing Stack Overflow answers and all kinds of things like that. Whereas when I've been writing C# professionally, I haven't really kept up with Java as much. Java has plenty of supporters, plenty of fans. It's an okay language. I just prefer C#. So yeah, C# is really where my heart is.
And what's the main reason of the preference? Like, what is the defining feature of C# that beats
It
Java?
feels like, and so to be clear, there's a lot has happened in Java since since I used it regularly. So I think I did write some Java 8, but it was, and you need to remember that I was writing Java within Google, and we need to standardize on which versions we use and things. So it was a while before I was able to use Java 8 at all. And so I was always a few years behind. And this is 5 years ago. So a lot of the features that I love in C# are now part of Java, but it has always felt like C# is sort of a better Java. It aligns more with the way I tend to think things should be, which is not to say it doesn't have its own problems. I could give you a list of things I would like to change about C#. That's fine. But both languages have been evolving a lot. They both sort of were quite static for a little while. Java a lot longer. You know, if you look at Java 1.0 to 1.4, not very much changed. And then there was generics in Java 1.5, and then nothing really happened for quite a long time. And then you've got lambdas and all kinds of stuff has happened. And C#, came out 2001-ish, and then got generics in .NET, C#2 with .NET 2, and a whole bunch of extra features at the same time. And then got link in C#3, then dynamic typing in C#4, then async in C#5, and it's had a more steady level of progress, I feel. And I don't know whether it's the way that the languages have been driven or the people involved, but I have huge respect for Mads Torgersen, who's the lead designer for C#. And it feels like it's up just in a slightly better place than Java, with the caveat that I haven't used Java significantly for quite a long time. So there are all kinds of features that I haven't used, and C#'s been copying Java for some things like default interface implementations. But C# just seemed to find a slightly cleaner design in a bunch of these things. And I suspect that is partly what the design process has been and who's been working on it. But it's really lovely. I do have a certain concern that the C# team are unapologetically always evolving the language, because Mads will tell you, if you stop, then the language will become obsolete. But equally, that means that there's always more to learn and more to learn. And just when you think you've got to the end, well, there's a new version comes out. At some point, I need to do the next edition of C# in depth, but I don't know when that's going to be, because I've got to find enough time to write about so many new language versions. And at this point, the approach that I've taken in the past probably doesn't even work with segregating it by version. I think I will need to start again from scratch and come up with a very different way of doing things. Lost my train of thought somewhat, or petered out, let's say. But yeah, I think C# just is a cleaner fit for my mental model of how I think about programming. And that is clearly partly a feedback loop of I've been writing a lot of C# for a long time. And it would probably do me good to learn another language and use it in anger. It just never seems to happen.
Would you say there's something in Java that's just way too convenient to do in Java compared to C#? Like, way too convenient.
Enum. Yeah. Java enums are really nice. I wish we had the equivalent of that in C#. There are ways of getting around it to some extent, but they're nice. I think pretty much everything else, I prefer the C# way of doing it.
Okay, and for a specific tech, for example, like mobile development, like Java is kind of like native for that, and Android. and C# has Xamarin, but that's not as good as Java. Do you agree?
So I haven't done any mobile development beyond a couple of Xamarin test apps. I like the Xamarin approach. I can see how there could be downsides to it. I'm looking forward to seeing how Maui does in .NET 6. Yeah, I'm not really qualified to answer. It doesn't feel like that's a language feature so much as, well, the platform happens to be built around this.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that Java is naturally a better language for mobile design or mobile apps, so much as, well, if you try to write with a completely different language, then that's not going to be great. And I think Xamarin does amazing things to make it as good as it is. And again, I haven't used that for a few years. I do worry that good people like yourself ask me for my opinion on so many things that I really don't have an informed opinion about. So I don't want people to get the wrong idea that, just because I say something about mobile development, I don't do mobile development. Don't take my word for it.
It's fine because you always at least try to find arguments and justify it, and as long as you do, it's a little bit more than an opinion. It's an argument, maybe a weak one, but it's an argument.
Yeah,
So
but
it's good.
but yeah, still from only a very limited perspective. So
Yeah,
I
yeah.
I would like to think I have a fairly reasonable idea of topics where I can justifiably give my opinion and arguments, knowing that I have tried a few different things and it's reasonable, versus stuff where I'm just blathering.
Yeah. Um, Out of all the things that you have done, what do you think is your greatest achievement? Like, what are you most proud of? Is it Stack Overflow or something else?
So historically, I'm proud of myself as a 11, 12-year-old. My first really big project back on the ZX Spectrum was writing a logo interpreter. So logo is this, I don't know whether you've come across it and other viewers, this language where you're in theory moving what's called a turtle, this little robotic thing with a pen, and you say forward 100, turn right 90 degrees, forward, etc. And we had that for the BBC Micros, that was the computer at school, but not for the Spectrum. And me being all of 11, 12, 13, whatever, I didn't know that implementing a programming language was not something that you just decided to do. So I thought, okay, well, I will write logo for the Spectrum. And I did. And I'm sure the code must have been ghastly, but it worked. And I was really proud of it. And, you could do loops and save your program and load the program and all kinds of things. And looking back on it, I'm really proud of my 11, 12, 13-year-old self for doing that. In terms of other things, I'm very pleased with Nodatime, the date and time API. That has turned out well, and I've enjoyed doing it, and I'm generally gratified with people's reaction to it. I am pleased with Stack Overflow, not for aren't I smart, but it's gratifying to believe you've helped a lot of people. And enough people have said, oh, your answers have helped me, that I can believe them and say, yeah, good, I'm glad. That's nice. And for writing C# in depth, I do enjoy that as an achievement as well. I think achievement sounds like a specific thing. What I would say I'm pleased about in my life is achieving a work-life balance, and how can I best express this? I would like to feel that I'm a fairly well integrated person, in that I think of things that are important to me. So my family is very important to me. I'm a committed Christian and committed feminist and committed software engineer who likes helping people. And I try to bring the whole of that self to all of those different areas. So over the last year during lockdown, I've spent a lot of time writing code for church, and occasionally helping my feminist friends in the Women's Equality Party in the UK, sometimes with technical things, sometimes with not technical things. I would like to hope that I bring my whole self to my family as well, but it's not like I compartmentalize, so I can be all of those things within all of those areas. And I don't know whether you would count that as an achievement or not, but it's something that I am pleased I've managed to do and hope I manage to keep doing.
It is both an achievement and in general a great success. It's just something I'm really jealous and wishing to achieve myself maybe sometime. It's great. Because people often find themselves lost, especially during the pandemics, between a good balance of work and their own
Mm-hmm.
life. It's just,
Yeah.
it happens in the same place, so you forget yourself and do
And
too
I
much
would
of
say that
either.
so normally an achievement that you take pride in is something that you think, well, it was because I did it. And I will note that I am in a very privileged position to be able to have work-life balance and do all of those things. If I were in a less well-paid job, even if I were, I think I'm a pretty good software engineer, but I could be pretty good at a number of other careers that would be less well paid, and therefore maybe I would need to spend more of my life doing work in order to pay the bills and things. So yeah, I'm not going to claim that I have the answer to how to achieve work-life balance and things, just that I'm lucky enough that I do have it.
Have you ever felt that someone, well, you are working in big companies like Google, and I do you ever find yourself sometimes scared by someone who might seem like way better at programming than you, and does that ever bother you, and does that ever put you down? And I'm referring to the imposter syndrome.
Um, hmm. So I'm certainly not bothered by seeing people who are better at coding than me, because this was partly I got a bit of um, a sharp lesson when I went from school to university. So at the school I was at, I would come top of most of the subjects or top or near the top of most things.
Yeah.
Academically, terrible at games and PE and things. But in terms of academic stuff, certainly by the time in the UK we have A levels, which are sort of what you do at 16, 17, 18. So I was doing stuff I was going to be good at. And it was all fairly comfortable. I didn't work as hard at school as I might have done. Then went to university. Suddenly, I'm middle of the road at best. And I regret to say I still didn't work as hard as I might have done. I spent rather longer doing computing and doing amateur dramatics than I think my director of studies would have liked me to do. I was studying maths and should have spent more time doing the maths, really. On the other hand, it turned out okay, and the amateur dramatics was how I met my wife, so I don't really regret that too much, but I'm lucky. But it meant that I got used then to being with people who were much smarter than I was, and that's continued since then. Anyone who is going to say they are the best at X, you're just setting yourself up for failure. Instead, if you say, right, well, what can I learn from someone else who's better at maybe one aspect of things, I may be better at something else. If I read your code and you have a particularly elegant design for one problem, but you mess up on the date and time handling somewhere else, then we can both gain. I can say, oh, well, if you treat this in this particular way, then that will be more successful. But I love what you've done over here. I'm going to nick that and use it in my code. That feels much more productive than going and saying, oh, woe is me, I'm not the absolute best. However, where imposter syndrome comes in is not in terms of how I feel work-wise so much. I'm reasonably comfortable that I'm good enough at my job. But it's almost the community has imposed imposter syndrome on me because of things like Stack Overflow. So people do kind of assume that they assume I know what I'm talking about, and sometimes that I shouldn't be challenged. So, you know, I've been involved in conversations where I've said one thing, someone else has said something else, and a third person has said, well, one of those arguments is by Jon Skeet, so it must be right. Like, no. I make mistakes just like everyone else, or maybe just have the wrong end of the stick about something. So yeah, it sometimes feels like the community puts me on a pedestal that no one could ever live up to. That does seem to happen slightly less than it used to, which is nice. But that's where I think imposter syndrome can definitely come in. I'm not going to live up to that impression, and I need to be careful that I don't try to think about myself as that ultra smart person. It's almost like there's the fictional Jon Skeet who is on the Chuck Norris page and things.
Yeah.
And I just need to remember that is divorced from the reality of very fallible me.
Yeah. Does that ever actually affect you, other than those side effects of discussions, that it kind of justifies the argument not for what you say but for who you are? I mean, does that ever get to you personally? Does that ever affect you personally as a person, like get you in your mind?
I only in that I need to consciously try to stop it from doing that, because everyone likes being praised.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can feel awkward if someone's complimenting you, but you will still go away and think, oh, that was nice. And if enough people say something that isn't true, you might still end up believing it a bit. And so you need to be careful about that. So yes, it affects me. I'm not going to lie and say, oh, I wish no one had heard of me. It's kind of nice when sometimes I'll interview someone at work, or even I've had it in very odd scenarios where I wouldn't expect anyone to particularly be a Stack Overflow user, and they say, are you the Jon Skeet? I'm a Jon Skeet. I may be the one that you're thinking of. My guess is that I probably am, because I don't know of any other Jon Skeets who would be the Jon Skeet, but yeah, that's kind of nice. But you need to keep it in perspective. And fortunately, my wife is a children's author and is very well known as a children's author. So I get to learn a bit of humility by, there will always be more people who know about my wife than about me, and that's absolutely fine. It's
very cool. So, being down to earth and talking about something that we all do, mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is your greatest regret or mistake in your throughout your career?
There are. It would be easy to say something like, I wish I had learned F# properly, or some other languages. But then the natural question is, okay, so what are you going to give up? It takes time to do something extra. What do you regret having done that would have been better as learning F# or whatever it is? And there's the simple answer of, well, imagine all the time that you've spent just sitting on the sofa watching TV. Well, no, I'm not going to take all that away because that's relaxation. I don't know. I don't think I have many. I have occasional active regrets. So I gave the example earlier on of a GitHub issue where you've reacted a bit more hostile. Sorry, that wasn't very good English. In a more hostile way than you might have wanted to. So I have small regrets like that. And I suspect a lot of people, I keep a back catalogue of those things and go, oh, if only I'd done something differently, whatever. I don't have any major regrets.
Have you ever messed up in something deployed in live, a production, a database, like, completely destroying the product for a moment or something?
There was one time where I was at a different company. I won't say which. I suspect they'd be okay with it, but I'd rather not risk it. Where we went live with a new authentication system and stuff just wasn't working. And I think that there was just something wrong in the cache. And I just said, okay, well, let's delete all the cache entries for this auth table, and things should start sorting themselves out. And they did. It worked, but it wasn't done in as well an orchestrated way. I didn't take a backup of the table beforehand or anything, and got hauled over the coals a little bit, told off about that. So that was a somewhat significant issue, but resolved within a quarter of an hour. Wow, I'm sorry. There was what looked like a hummingbird or some bird that was just hovering just outside my window, and it was spectacularly beautiful. I do wish I'd caught that for you, but there we go. I don't think I've caused any other significant outages. I had a friend who brought down Gmail briefly, for only for the whole of Europe. It didn't hit the US, I don't think. And I suspect for reasons that now would not happen. This was 10 years ago. I've had occasions where I've been on call and we've had to fix something very quickly. There was a time where some storage we were using was running out, and it ran out. So we were going to migrate something to a different storage layer that had much more space. And we ran out of space earlier than we were expecting to. So that was a bit of a sudden, panic stations, must fix everything now. That was a long night. But that was not a disaster because my friend and colleague Douglas and I sorted it. It was fine. It was a bit panicky. But yeah, I can't think of any other major outage kind of problems.
It's fine. That's you're actually so far the first one who hasn't mentioned a table drop in production or something similar. Just cool. Do you have any moments in particular in your career that you would say was a breakthrough in the way you saw code or programming or programmer's profession, like something that just completely was a breakthrough for you as a professional?
I remember the first project that I started using unit tests on. I was working with, I'd only been at the company for about a year, but I had made very firm friends with, there was a team of 4 of us, and certainly 2 of them were 2 of the leads within the company. So they were sort of the elite. But this was back in, I think, 2004 or something. So it's not like unit testing was brand new, but it was fairly new. And we leapt into I think the other members of the team hadn't done Java before, but I had. None of us had done mocking, and mocking was what made the unit tests really make sense to me. Now, since then, I have learned to distance myself from mocking a bit. There are other kinds of fakes that I would use, often in preference to mocks. Mocks have their place as well, but the idea of a test double was new to me, along with dependency injection and things, and that definitely changed how I looked at everything. And that was a fantastic project to work on. We really we did pair programming, which I haven't done very much, and I sort of regret not having. You were asking earlier about regrets. I regret not having spent more time pair programming, but it depends on the project. But in this project, we all massively enjoyed doing it. Yeah.
All right. And what advice that you received stayed with you or touched you the most? Like, what's the best advice that you have been given and would like to share with others?
I think it's Eric Lippert gave some good advice about being the go-to person for one topic, and it sort of doesn't matter what that topic is, but get really good at one thing and be adequate at other things. So go deep into, in my case, I've gone fairly deep on dates and times, fairly deep on C# as a language, and I'm also very interested in versioning. There are many areas that I know nothing at all, and many areas that I know enough to get by. So, when it comes to handling Unicode carefully, I'm comfortable enough that I know what to avoid around surrogate pairs and things. There are plenty of other areas that I don't know much on within Unicode. But the idea that don't just try to be what's called in the UK a jack of all trades, so someone who's okay at everything. Try to find some topic that if someone on your team wants to know about whatever it is, they will come to you. And that's a really rewarding thing to do and is useful professionally as well. So assuming I'm not misrepresenting Eric's advice, that's the advice I'd like to pass on.
Yeah, that's really good advice. So that was, I think, my last question.
Okay.
Would you like to add anything about yourself, references to you, your books, contacts?
Anyone can find the book. Search for C# in depth, you'll find it. That's easy. Just to reiterate, if you are interested in feminism or think you might find feminism interesting, Everyday Sexism is great. There's another book that's I'm now blanking on the name of, by Emer O'Toole, and it's absolutely amazing. Girls Will Be Girls is fantastic. And there's another one about sexism within Silicon Valley. Brotopia, that's it. Brotopia by Emily Chang. So there are 3 book recommendations if you feel like, I'm not going to pressure anyone into starting reading feminist tracts, but I can recommend all of those.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Cool.
So that will be all. Thank you. Really appreciate your time. It was
Thank you. My pleasure.
so much fun talking with you.
You too. Okay. Take care. Have a nice evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.